Katie is Principal Advisor Engineering from the Ministry of Building, Innovation and Employment here in New Zealand. We worked together when I worked there, and Katie has led the whole work program on Embodied or Upfront carbon in the Building for Climate Change program there. So she's going to give us an introduction to the approach that's been taken there and where things might be at this point in time. I'll give you 10 minutes, Katie, to hand over to
Great. Thanks. I'm just hoping that you can see a green square with a green screen with some trees on it.
Yep, we've got your slide.
Brilliant. Great. Thanks. Well, tēnā koutou katoa, he mihi nui, he mihi mahana, kia koutou katoa. Ko Katie Symons taku ingoa ki hikina whakatutuki aho e mahi ana kei ototai aho e noho ana. Hi, I'm Katie Symons. So yeah, as everyone said, I work at MBIE, but I live in Christchurch, which explains why I'm not able to be with you in person today. But I was very pleased to come and talk to you about yeah, my favourite topic, as everyone knows well. So I'll crack into it, and yeah, I thought I'd talk about an aspect of embodied carbon that I'm quite passionate about, called technical infrastructure, and I'll go into some detail about what that is. So, but first of all, where are we in New Zealand with our embodied carbon policy? A bit of a potted history, summarised in 3 documents, I think. So back in 2020, shortly after Elrond and I started working at MBIE, the Building for Climate Change programme was launched by the publication of these 2 frameworks, one on operational emissions that Elrond was heavily involved in, and the other one on whole of life embodied carbon emissions reduction. So that was published in 2020, and that kind of sort of put forward the idea of mandating reporting of embodied carbon together with, at a building consent stage, followed by caps at a later date. Fast forward 2 more years and we had an emissions reduction plan. So chapter 12 of that emissions reduction plan, that's number 1, was on the building and construction sector. So that was, our branch was the key kind of author of that chapter. And if you recall, that chapter had each chapter had objectives and actions that each part of the economy was going to take to reduce emissions. And objective 1 was reduce embodied carbon of that building and construction chapter. Action 1.1 was progress regulatory change to enable that. But fast forward another 2 years, and this was the discussion document that was published a couple of weeks ago on a proposed emissions reduction plan 2. So obviously we've had a change of government since then, and the approach that, well, yeah, buildings and construction wasn't really mentioned very much in this document at all. What was there was talked about using more wood in buildings, but the whole document was kind of reframed to align with our new government's, or the coalition government, I should say, the climate change strategy, which is proceeding to reduce emissions with a net-based, market-led and least cost approach. So that's kind of where we are now. And what does that mean for, well, wider as well, what are the priorities in this coalition government for the building construction portfolio? Pretty simple. It's making it easier and more affordable to build. It's reducing red tape in construction wherever possible. And one part of that is smoothing the consenting process. So obviously, as the kind of central regulator, we are being tasked to do lots of things that enable these priorities. What does that look like for emissions reduction action or climate mitigation in the building construction sector? So we are working with the Minister of Building and Construction to kind of finalise and get some kind of concrete actions that that he's kind of happy that we can proceed with. You know, his priority has been some of that other stuff, so work on products and granny flats you might have seen. He's kind of turning his mind to this now. But we know that it's going to be around these kind of 4 areas. So encouraging voluntary action to reduce emissions, light touch regulation, but yeah, focused on voluntary action, providing more compliance options or pathways for low carbon buildings, empowering the sector to make better informed decisions, It's about balancing those costs. Obviously, cost is front and foremost in this sector, in this government's mind, but recognising benefits of lower carbon buildings. And the red thing has popped up because this is what I want to talk about more. Really, it's increasing consistency and confidence in emissions measurement. Sorry. So yeah, because we measure to manage, and ideally, hopefully, the objective is to reduce emissions. And we're seeing in global climate policy a trend towards these kind of data-driven approaches. That obviously we rely on, therefore, verifiable, measurable performance outcomes. And graphs like this is taken from an example embodied carbon assessment that we published last year, kind of becoming more familiar with knowing what numbers look like for embodied carbon. This is in kilograms of carbon equivalent per meter squared of a building, and broken down by life cycle stages. And those modules A, B, C, D, perhaps been touched on already, but my point is that for embodied carbon, it's quite challenging, this whole measurement thing, because it's really quite complex and it's really quite hidden. You can't see the embodied carbon of a building when it's built. It doesn't appear, it doesn't correlate to an energy bill that you might get every year, like operational emissions. It's inherently uncertain. So, the life cycle stages kind of put up in a diagram there that, yeah, you may be familiar with. Those, a lot of activities happen over the life cycle of a building. And many challenges include predicting the future, also understanding the past, knowing where my material has come from, what energy effort has gone into it, and therefore emissions have been caused by me using it here. We know there are gaps in available data, and we know data quality and sometimes the credibility of data is called into question as well. We're not 100% confident on those things. So a way to address those things is to have a kind of robust system of technical resources, and that's what I would call technical infrastructure. So to kind of illustrate this a bit more, sorry, I know this slide's a bit busy, but I kind of think of the kind of 6 key elements of technical infrastructure for embodied carbon. Starting from the left, moving over, so you've got standards, essentially life cycle assessment or LCA kind of rules that very high level tell you where you should draw system boundaries and kind of quite techie terms. But so we're getting some consistency on how we're looking at a life cycle of a building. A methodology is more of a kind of practical way to apply rules to a building assessment, and we at MB published a methodology a couple of years ago on assessing embodied carbon for buildings in New Zealand. Data, it's about, okay, so where do I get those key kind of carbon coefficients? So if I know how much material is going into my building, which is also a challenge, and we need data for that, but what do I assume as the emissions for that material? So that kind of data is quite challenging, and we're pretty lucky in New Zealand that brands have been working on this for many years and do have a good kind of database built up. Construct is sort of one way it manifests itself. It's an Excel-based thing. Tools, so we know that software that kind of automates the assessment process is really useful, and for Passive House, sure people might be familiar with Sustainable Engineering's one, the Carbonator, which I enjoyed listening to about a couple of, I haven't quite finished that one, I'll go back. But that's one example of a tool. Benchmarks, this is where we're kind of getting to the point where, well, how do we know what good looks like for embodied carbon outcomes? If I've done my assessment and I look at it and, okay, what does that actually mean? How can I judge myself against my performance and know whether I've done well or not, whether I need to improve? So those benchmarks are really important. We don't really have those in New Zealand at the moment, but it could look something like that graph, kind of look like something on your fridge. And then finally, kind of education, basically kind of wrap around all of this, further guidance material, training, case studies, those examples that I mentioned before, we published some, but there's many, many more examples. In fact, there's many, many more examples of all of this technical infrastructure. And, that slide was busy. This gets really busy. So, standards, yes, we've got ISO standards. We've also got a European suite of standards that kind of do the same thing at that life cycle standard stage. Methodology, yes, there's an MB methodology, but there's also a New Zealand Green Building Council methodology for Green Star. Structural engineers have a good, really good guidance from the UK, from the iStructE. The RICS published a global standard to do whole of life carbon assessments just last year. Data, again, there's obviously brand stuff, there's EPDs, there's EC3 as a kind of EPD, another database that holds New Zealand EPDs. People might have heard about Master Spec. There was some news about Master Spec working with brands to develop a database. Tools, this is where it gets really busy. There's loads of them. I won't go through the kind of the ones there, but they're just the ones that we know are being used in New Zealand today. There's an awful lot of them. Benchmarks, so we do have some kind of compare is a rough kind of tool that's used in New Zealand that can be used to kind of judge how you're performing. But there are other kind of better, more developed benchmarking databases from overseas. And finally, education. There's a lot of work going on here. Brands, NZGBC really lead in this space, but you know, other things from overseas that we can apply in New Zealand as well. So I'll just sort of finish off by saying, you know, what is the role of government in technical infrastructure? Well, our work to date and, you know, potential future work is, you know, we've been working in this area, and some things include identifying gaps. So there are still some gaps in where technical infrastructure is, and we want to try and fill them and try and encourage others to fill them where necessary. So for instance, we are working on a new pilot platform for developing future benchmarks, so to fill in those question marks on that previous slide. You know, the minister, we know this government's really keen on supporting sector-led initiatives and, you know, wanting government to kind of stand out the way. So supporting those initiatives that will fill those gaps. And the example I've already mentioned is that Brands Master Spec partnership to kind of make the already sort of lots of data that brands have, make it a bit more accessible. But also kind of steer these sector efforts towards achieving consistent outcomes and, you know, a single source of truth. So that's what we tried to do with the methodology in 2022, and it's really great to see how others have picked that up and kind of adopted it, you know, added detail. So that's been really great to see. Because I think, you know, overall, we want to see that this technical infrastructure, developing it now, creates a pathway towards what we all know is needed to get to stronger emissions reductions, which is, you know, stronger interventions, and, you know, making that happen when it's, you know, politically and economically possible. And I'll just finish by saying, you know, every decision in the construction process has an embodied carbon impact. And the more kind of tools, resources, technical infrastructures out there to allow people to assess the embodied carbon of that, the better. So we want to work collaboratively with the sector and other initiatives to support this better informed decision making, and there's nothing stopping us doing that now. Thanks. I'm sorry I went a bit over time, but I'm happy to answer any questions, but realise there's another speaker and a panel session to go.
Thanks, Katie. That's great.